Hello and welcome to the first ever bonus episode of the Poisons and Pestilence podcast. If this podcast series was an old filing cabinet, then each bonus episode would be a crisp £10 note surreptitiously hidden between the folders and folders of dusty CBW history and bad jokes. Now today, I am very lucky to be speaking with our guest, Mike Kenner. Mike has dedicated a not insignificant number of years investigating open-air trials of biological weapon simulants over the green and pleasant land that is Blighty. What we are talking about today then are attempts by the UK military to model potential adversary attacks on the UK during the paranoid years of the Cold War. This work occurred in the context of broader offensive and defensive programs, and as we will hear, would culminate in environmental trials in which millions of people in the UK were unwittingly exposed to these experiments. These trials then are a good test case for understanding how ethical norms around such research are worked out and how they can evolve over time in response to political pressure. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the world was quite a different place. States had stockpiled and developed deterrent chemical weapons and, to a lesser extent, biological weapon capabilities. In Europe during World War II, for various reasons, but not least the threat of retaliation, these stocks laid unused. However, both types of weapon had been utilised by the Japanese in Manchuria, with horrifying consequences. In the UK, the use by Japan of CW and BW, as well as the discovery of the extent of the German nerve agent program, and hardening relations with the Soviets, as well as the absence of domestic nuclear deterrent in the immediate aftermath of the war, motivated an expansion of both defensive and offensive work in the area of CBW, justified, in the early days, in terms of a need for a strategic WMD deterrent, as well as for the capability for like-for-like retaliatory response to the Soviet use of these weapons. In this context, the UK collaborated closely with the US and Canada on the issue of chemical and biological warfare and defence. Much of the UK's work centred on field trials of numerous weapon agents, first at remote sites in the UK such as Porton Down and Gurnard Island off the west coast of Scotland, later referred to as Anthrax Island. Later, the UK would also engage in much larger so-called hot trials at sea, involving live agents in various remote and exotic places, all of which, of course, occurred largely without the public knowing about them. This broader context forms the backdrop of this bonus episode, which is in fact the first of a two-parter. In this episode, we focus on the work carried out by scientists from Porton Down up until the mid-1960s, which involved the spread of zinc cadmium sulphide over vast swathes of the UK. In part 2, we trace this history further into the 60s and 70s and look at large area simulant trials involving bacteria such as E.coli. This would come to be referred in the press years later as the Lyme Bay Trials. In the second show, we will take a deeper dive not only into what these trials involved, but also the political fallout of this work as it came to broader public attention from the 1990s onwards. In particular, we will focus on inquiries which decades on reviewed safety practices at the time and considered what risks the public might have unwittingly been exposed to. Now, if you happen to pick up any major history of UK biological warfare written in the past decade or so, it's very likely you'll see Mike acknowledged, and his investigations have provided the factual basis for numerous documentaries. As ever, you can find links to these, as well as other information, in the show notes. I hope you enjoy the show today.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for inviting me. Very cold day, but it's an ideal during warfare weather. So this is when they did the trials. It's a good opportunity to discuss this extensive subject.
Exactly right. For context, Mike and I both are currently recording in very different parts of the southwest of England. And as we will find out, we have more in common than we would perhaps like to as far as the history of biological and chemical warfare is concerned. So, for some people listening today, what we're talking about might be a little bit esoteric. So I thought it might be useful just at the top of the show if you could give us a kind of back of an envelope description of what is meant by biological weapons simulant trial.
In my mind, a BW simulant is a supposedly harmless substance which mimics the physical properties of a real biological warfare agent without causing any adverse health effects. That's what it's meant to be. It's often used in public area BW experiments, which by their very nature prohibit the dissemination of a disease-causing agent. The typical BW simulant, it can be a chemical compound such as Porton used zinc, cadmium sulphide extensively, or it can be a bacterium such as E. coli or Bacillus glabidii, both of which were used by Porton Down, as we'll discover later. Whether you use a chemical or a bacterium, the ideal simulant particle size is identical to that of a real biological warfare agent. And this is the most important part of it, I think. It's normally between 1 and 6 microns in size. That's the mean sort of like definition, anywhere in between there or fit in with what Porton are normally looking for. This size, unfortunately, enables what the real agent does, how it gains access to the body. So it enables a biological warfare particle, including simulants, to evade the body's natural defenses, penetrate deep into the lungs, right into the alveoli.
I wondered if you were happy to talk about how you ended up looking at such a kind of niche aspect of a niche topic area.
Yeah, I mean, you could remember I'm a child of the late 60s. I left school in 1970. So there was a great deal of attention into war planning at the time. Cold War was raging. You had the Vietnam War going on. You had the Vietnam War protests going on. You'd had CND throughout the 60s. So there were books starting to appear on the horizon, which talked about biological warfare, and most notably was Seymour Hersh. He brought one out in the late 60s, which was sort of like the Bible at the time. No one knew very much about it. Porton Down only really admitted that they had a biological warfare section, although they prefer to call it the Microbiological Research Establishment. Around about 1966, 67. The public opprobrium was so much that they had to open up in 68 and have open days. With that background in mind, I started work as a post office engineer's apprentice, 1970. In 1971, I was put on the main distribution frame as part of your duties as your training. You do so many months. And I was working on the MDF. You get things called advice notes come through, and basically it's connecting the exchange equipment to the customer's line. And on the advice note, it said fleet, Sea Bar and Farm Fleet, or Crown Land Fleet. And it said Microbiological Research Establishment. And alarm bells started ringing in my head then. I thought, hang on a minute. I've read Seymour's book. He does a small chapter in there, and it says that our germ warfare facility in this country is called the very same. So I went and had a word at the end of the day with my boss, a senior chap that was there who happened to also be my father. It sounds like nepotism. It wasn't. It didn't work out well for either of us. Anyway, I went and had a word, and I said, I see the germ warfare boys are down in Weymouth. And he sort of like, Dad used to do a lot of defense communications work, and he just put on his defense communications face and sort of like an instant denial. Oh, are they, my son? He said. And with that was it. So I went in the next day, and all DP records, distribution point records, written in pencil. And I went there, and it had been rubbed out. So that was gone. So that's when I first knew, 1971. And I used to creep around the area every now and then just to see if we could see anyone. When I was a child, I remember seeing what appeared to be a barrage balloon above this area, but didn't think too much about it. We move on really to the mid-1990s. There was a cluster of childhood leukemias on the fleet. They stretch from White Regis going up to sort of Bexington way, all the way up the fleet. For those who don't know, the fleet is a body of water that separates the Chesil Bank, as geographers like to call it, or Chesil Beach if you're a local, from the mainland. It's sort of like a seawater lagoon. I was talking to a couple of people who knew the families that were involved, and I thought, hang on a minute, we've got a germ warfare base. Standards were appalling in those days. They would have just flushed anything they were using straight into the sea. all the women that I knew that had had children affected by it had been swimming in the sea. They liked what is now known as wild swimming. So I thought, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. Is there a link? So I talked to the families, and one of the families phoned up the Ministry of Defence to ask. And curiously, they got a response. And a senior army, I think he was a colonel, came down to the nearby Chickwell camp and interviewed, talked to them and said, well, I've talked to the chaps at Porton Down, and they do say that, yes, they did operate outstations, as they called them in those days. Maybe this is one of them, but I can assure you nothing happened. Long story short, I was involved in an environmental protest that was going on at the time. And through that, the local television company came down. They wanted to do an interview, and I happened to mention in passing, and they covered this, but they didn't get anywhere. That was 1995. Roll on to 1997, February the 2nd. I know that because it was my father's birthday. And the Sunday Telegraph published a groundbreaking article. It was Andrew Gilligan and Rob Evans, which announced that I think it was 12 or 13 experiments have been done in this area that involved the release of live bacteria, a lot of them. And that's from there. I contacted initially Ken Livingstone because he was the MP quoted. He put me on to Rob Evans. I talked to Rob Evans, and the rest is history.
So, Mike, reading your work, you tend to distinguish between two major time periods in trials you've looked at. The first period that we're going to look at today's show is between roughly 52 and 64. And this is large area field trials, is that right?
Yes. It was basically, it started off small, but what happened is in 1949, the senior meteorologist at Porton Down, a chap called Ananson, was doing a series of experiments in Salisbury. He got permission to do this from the local authorities purely because he told them that he was investigating smoke pollution. They were very enthusiastic and allowed him to go to an area which was quite aptly known as Gas Lane. And he was conducting experiments there in reality to work out munitions expenditure for a cluster chemical weapons bomb. So he did these experiments, and as he did them and the results were coming through, by about 1952, he'd done other, the series of trials over the years were coming to an end in Salisbury. He concluded that there was a case for long distance travel of chemical and biological warfare. And he produced a paper on this subject, the long distance travel. This went to many different departments and quite high up in Whitehall, and all those various little small clandestine committees that the Ministry of Defence had at the time. And it received support all the way through. So round about by 1952, the start of 1953, they started doing very, very small trials. First, they had to work out what are we going to use as a BW simulant for this. By this time, they'd moved over. They realised it wouldn't be a chemical warfare thing, the long distance of travel, because they didn't have an agent at the time that would be capable of doing long distance travel. So it was purely a biological warfare thing. So they moved over and they decided to do what the Americans have been doing and using a substance which they refer to always as FP, fluorescent particles. It sounds nicer than using the word cadmium. The FP was zinc cadmium sulphide, as we know. And the thing about why it was used is that you could spray it. It would travel a certain distance. You could sample it, and the early samplers were just a piece of basically sellotape with a vacuum on it that would draw in any of the air around, and hopefully the particles would stick to the sellotape. And that's very crude of me to say that, but that's roughly what it was. Either that or they'd use slides that were covered with some sort of sticky substance, and the same thing would happen. Then afterwards, what they do is they take them to a dark room. They shine a UV light on them. With a microscope, they count the particles on there. It was that crude. It relied totally on the ability of people not to get fatigued in doing this to get an accurate count. It had so many variables. An accurate count is not possible, and they weren't really looking for an accurate count at the time. They just wanted to know, will this travel from A to B? If it does, If we can measure the concentration, that's good. If that's a bit debatable, it doesn't matter as long as we get a rough idea. So they started these trials in RAF Bewley in 1953. Very crude. Land Rover had what they call a Stanford Generator, because Stanford University pioneered this. Mounted on the back, they'd hand pour the stuff in. Presumably, it turns out they were all wearing protective gear when they did this. And they were measuring over quite short distances. And then they expanded on this. They were using at the time something called a cascade impactor. Then they thought, well, hang on a minute, let's see how far out we can get this. So they started venturing further afield with their sampling position. And there was one trial that was carried out 27th of April 1954. A Land Rover was based on the Porton Range. It was firing at 51 grams a minute, so 3 kilograms were used in total of zinc cadmium sulphide. And they set up sampling arcs 25 and 50 miles away in an area from Blandford to south of Warminster, and from near Portisham in Dorset to Castlecarey in Somerset. Picked up the material. Cloud went clean through the 25-mile arc and reached the 50-mile arc. So on the basis of this, they thought, well, hang on a minute, let's see if we can extend this. And what they decided to do was mount it on this time, they'd always been point sources, i.e. there would be a static source. It didn't move. The samplers, if they moved, they moved around to try and find the cloud. This time they thought we'll have static samplers, and we'll actually do a line source. We'll have a vehicle driving along, spraying out zinc cadmium sulphide all the time, and we'll see how far that goes. Does that work? You can see them gradually building up. I mean, it was apart from the dangers involved to the general public, you can see, yes, it makes sense. We've started, yes, we can do it from a point source. We can get it a couple of miles. We've got it up to 50 miles. Now we're going to see what happens if we drive and do it. And they did it, and they got exactly the same results. And I mean, they started spraying anywhere. Dorset in the south of England, obviously, Hampshire, parts of Somerset and Wiltshire, they all get it because they're all very close to Porton Down. If you live within a budgetary distance that makes it economical to do a trial of Porton Down, they're going to do one near you. They tended to veer more towards the west because the winds were more coming from the west. They're predominantly southwesterly winds. So that helped them later on, that they could do the actual trials spraying in Dorset and sit on the Porton Range and try and catch the cloud.
And just for our international listeners, so it's fair to say that Wiltshire in the southwest is quite rural, but at the same time, the towns and cities are still towns and cities and are significant populations. And I guess we'll talk a little bit about some of the population numbers that were potentially exposed later on. Porton itself is very isolated. It's still quite hard to find. But when you're dealing with area trials of this scale, you're very quickly exposing large numbers of people because of the fact that this whole part of the country.
The thing about Porton and Dorset in particular is quite interesting. When they were setting up Porton, they were also thinking of setting up a place where it was nice and remote, where they could experiment with the early tanks. And Porton did initially come down to the Lulworth area, and they were looking to see if that was suitable to build the initial place for doing gas warfare and for experimenting on it. So Dorset had a lucky escape in some ways, but Porton still found them in the 60s. In the end, the tank, as we know, the tank research was then carried out at Lulworth and Bovington, in that area, and Porton decided to move up near Amesbury, where they are. I think it was the fact that on a map it appears that it's so rural that Porton felt that they could do these trials. There's later trials which I'll come into, where they know that they should be sampling in London, but they won't put the sampling units in there. They say really we had to put the sampling units on the edges of London because if word had got out that Porton were actually admitting that the cloud was in there would have been a little bit of a public outcry. The cloud still went into London. It's just that there were no overt signs of having men walking around with Wellington boots with CDEE written on them. So yes, they were very. They make out that they were. How can I put it? Graydon Carter covers it. I don't know whether you want to go into that now, but Graydon Carter covers it quite well when he examined for the Ministry of Defence in 1999, 2000, around about that period. He was tasked by them to go over the history, to collate all the documents that still existed about the zinc cadmium sulphide trials. This is in response to Rob Evans' article, many local articles, me phoning them up every 5 minutes saying, what have you been up to this week? He could not find any documentation at all that Porton showed any concern whatsoever that they were going to be spraying this material over populated areas, even though they also knew that they had never subjected zinc cadmium sulphide for toxicity trials prior to doing this. And he does quite a bit of his report relates to this. Essentially, there's no evidence that the toxicity of zinc cadmium sulphide was identified in any practical way by CDE. So the public weren't part of the plan.
So, Mike, as I understand it, in the early years, you had Porton Down, who were doing various types of trials in the UK and abroad. And during the kind of immediate post-war period, they got very interested in modelling potential biological weapon attacks and how would potentially move around. And as part of this, they'd developed a preferred method for looking at the movement of clouds of particulates. And zinc cadmium was their preferred simulant. But at this point, they weren't sure of toxicity of this particular simulant. But for whatever reason, decisions made at this point in history seem to have continued to inform thinking and decision-making several decades later. So the direction of movement was established in the kind of 50s, and then they continued to build their policy in that way. Moving then towards the kind of later 1950s, what was the kind of main work happening at Porton late 50s onwards?
I think that, yeah, the major change came through in 1957 when there had been talk building up in the tripartite meetings that used to occur between Canada, America, and the UK. The large area coverage concept kept popping up and then going back down again. The Americans thought that there were too many meteorological reasons for the large area coverage concept not to work. They also didn't think that bacteria could survive a long distance travel, so they weren't sure. But by 1956, Porton had put pay to all that. And 57, they produced a paper, and it was a joint paper between the various branches of Porton Down, the chemical weapons side and the biological weapons side. And they brought forward something which is basically known as the large area coverage concept. The paper contrasted the older tactical method of BW attack by using bombs or cluster munitions with a strategic method of covering an enormous area with very, very little amount of suspension needed, bacterial suspension needed. Say one aircraft bomb load could probably cover an area of 30 square miles, but the potential of the large area coverage concept, and I better explain what that is. That involved a standoff attack, normally offshore. In the case of like the UK, it would be an aircraft or a ship, or even, I don't think they had them at the time, but a cruise missile that was capable of it anyway, that would go down the coastline spraying all the time. The air movement could be carried on shore and just would contaminate the whole country. Now, what Porton had proved that the only factor which would make this impractical was biological decay, and they had been working and finding out that no, actually, that we have got some bacteria, potential BW agents, that could survive very long distances of travel, presumably as long as they're only done in hours of darkness. But you can cover a large area in 10 hours, especially if you do it in the winter months. The other thing is that they managed to prove to the United States that no, actually, there's at least 50 times a year that Britain is wide open to an LAC attack. So Porton were good. They could be accused of being empire building a bit. They not only showed that we should we change our policy and decide to use it for offensive methods? It's feasible. So that opens up a line of research and research funding. But also the UK is extremely vulnerable to this. Oh my God, we better do something immediately and investigate how great it's a danger to the UK. So there were two aspects of funding could come flying through off of this paper, and it worked.
So just to talk a little bit about the scenario now for the podcast listeners, we are both sat currently basking in glorious winter sunshine. So it's bright, but very, very cold. So would today be too sunny for a successful simulant trial, do you think?
That's a problem, because later on they did develop a substance that would protect bacteria from the sunlight.
Really?
That happens in the late 60s, yes.
So in the early days, the idea was that the conditions...
It would always be nighttime.
Nighttime.
Well, they had two times that they really liked, and meteorologically, and that would be dusk and dawn, basically. I think you can safely say that biological warfare attacks were going to be nighttime. That's what they assumed back in the 50s and the early 60s. What they were mainly worried about was pollution. If you had too much air pollution, that might affect what's going on. It might affect the viability of any organism. It did cause problems with them trying to do accurate counts. And that's the problem that we have. When we move on to after the large area coverage paper was produced by MRE, they start doing very big trials indeed. We've moved away from Land Rovers now. We've moved into converting Hastings or Valletta aircraft. They'd fly 200, 100, 200, maybe a 300-mile track. They'd either come down the north coast, it would always be in the sea, down the north coast and along the channel, or along the channel and up the Irish Sea. The target was always England and Wales, never Scotland. I haven't found out why. I'd imagine that it's so remote that getting sampling units up there is quite tough. They involved 60, 70 sampling stations across the country. They use Ministry of Supply outstations, they use RAF stations. Even the United States Air Force were involved. They had sampling units set up, and Porton Down themselves would have a team of 9 to 10 mobile sampling teams. So they were sort of, I imagine, more like troubleshooters. They could go to an area that wasn't covered by the outstations, or, like I say, they were troubleshooters insofar as when they sprayed the cloud, they might have got an indication that the wind shifted, and we haven't got a sampling station there, and they'd fire off a Porton mobile sampling team. And basically men in a Land Rover wearing duffel coats, operating what is known as a drum impactor, which is it's a unit that measures as the air is drawn in through a vacuum. It goes onto this sticky substance and then it clicks round. It's clockwork, I believe. And it moves round in 5-minute increments. And then they can watch in the laboratory then the arrival of the cloud and the cloud leaving.
So they see what sticks to the...
I mean, a very similar principle was used later on for the biological warfare trials that used live bacteria.
So is there stories in the early years of local people seeing or suspecting things going on? I mean, or is it something that sort of appeared under the radar?
In the very early years, funny enough, you see, I'd just better explain to everybody that in the grand scheme of things, the discovery of the series of trials, the zinc cadmium trials, were the last trials that we managed to get Porton to declassify. So we sort of do the whole thing backwards. The investigation came from the biological bacterial trials to the zinc cadmium sulphide trials, and we work our way right back to Anderson in Gas Lane in Salisbury. And there was a witness. I think she was 6 or 7, and Rob Evans did a lot of work on this, and a marvelous book he brought out called Gassed. I'd recommend anyone to read that. And there's a segment in it, Clouds of Deceit, and it covers the early years of these trials. More trials came to light after his book was published, but in response to his book, a woman wrote to him, and her name was Enid Forrester Addy, and she was a delightful woman. And Rob said, "Have you ever heard of her?" I said, "I don't know. I'll call her up. I'll see if I can track her down." And Enid was marvelous. And she remembered being a small child in Gas Lane. And what she remembered is that these men came round wearing duffel coats. and putting what she saw were gas meters, old-fashioned gas meters, and chaining them to lampposts and then going around. And then afterwards, there would be this strange smell of like gravy in the air. All she remembers vividly was a policeman carting away one of the someone who'd stolen one of these and was trying to take it down the scrapyard. And there was a great fuss that was going on. They had to break into the chap's house and take it away. And I said to her, "Is there anyone else who could witness this?" And she said, "Yes, it was a little boy I played with." So I went and she gave me his telephone number. She said he still lives in the area. So I phoned the chap up and I said, "I've been told that you witnessed these trials. Did you know what was happening?" He said, "No, I didn't, but I do remember it." He said, "Strange thing is," he said, "is I worked with Porton Down later on." I said, "Oh, what did you do?" He said, "Oh, they had a special aircraft and I flew it. And this was the pilot of the icing tanker aircraft, which we'll get to another time." Yes, people did see things, especially with the later trials, which I'll tell you, there's a lovely story with the Lyme Bay Trials. But no, in the main, what happened is that Porton were always told, if anyone asks you what's going on, we're investigating air pollution. What they forgot to mention was that they were the ones causing the pollution. I mean, Graydon Carter, he mentions it, and I think it almost passes for humour in Porton Down. You know, that's what we're doing. He wasn't. He was investigating how to conduct small-scale biological warfare over an area greater than 1,000 square miles.
So, at the moment, then, we're just coming out of the kind of period 57, 1960, and so it's clear here that we've already come a far way from the back of Land Rovers in terms of the type of work that's been done and the distances that have been covered. You noted that, people were being exposed to this stuff. And as a side note, by the way, we're going to be sharing some of the materials we've talked about today for people to go and read further on, particularly things like health concerns around certain agents and certain simulants and those sorts of things. So we'll post those in the discussion notes for the podcast. So one thing that I was particularly interested in as someone who was local to the Southwest was discussion of cities and the fact that there was work focusing specifically on Norwich and Salisbury. I was very surprised this hadn't come up at least as a disinformation line in certain coverage. So could you maybe talk a little bit about the kind of maybe the role that some of these cities played?
Yes, absolutely. Salisbury was used normally. I think initially, you've got to remember everything is down to budget with Porton Down. So if they could do it on the cheap, they do it on the cheap, obviously. That's the reason that they selected zinc cadmium sulphide. It was so cheap, comparatively cheap. So they decided that as a moving on from the large area coverage trials, they thought, well, what would happen if we hit a city with it? With one of these large area coverage trials, we know we can spread it to a city, but what happens in the city? And in particular, they were interested to see whether the heat from the city generated at night would enable or prevent the cloud from coming down and then being inhaled by people. So they decided to use a city, and they picked on Salisbury. And it's quite remarkable. I've got a grid which I will share with you, and I'll try and put it up on my Twitter feed later. They established a remarkable grid around Salisbury. It was rural, so it was quite a large rural grid. I forget how far away the sampling units were, but you can say they're 2 or 3 miles apart. And then in the centre of Salisbury, there were a number of urban sampling points, again on the grid. An aircraft would fly about 40 miles away to the west. They were relying on the southwesterly wind coming in, flying at about 1,000 feet. Sometimes they used to do it lower, but normally about 1,000 feet. And it sprayed a 100-mile arc. I think it was 100 mile. They wait for the wind to come through. You get early warning from the rural pickets. They set up a mobile darkroom, so you could get early warning of the cloud. It's coming in. Okay, make sure everyone's on their toes. They involved the Salisbury police.
So the mobile darkroom, this is still, is this to do with the drum sampling you were talking about earlier on,
Yeah,
or
what they had is cascade impactors and drum samplers.
what are these?
Basically, a bit of sticky that's lying there flat, and a bit of sticky that's on a drum.
Okay,
and
okay,
you
see, thank you.
you can either put a vacuum behind it or you don't. But I mean,
Yeah.
you normally put a vacuum behind it that will suck in at a specific rate. So I think they normally sucked in people at rest, 10 liters a minute,
Yeah.
which really should be about 20.
Oh, so it was actually simulating the
Oh, it was
lump.
simulating it. Yeah,
Yeah.
everything Porton Down for the sampling units like that. The aspiration rate is normally aimed at what would a human being be doing. So you
Oh,
can see it's not purely defensive trials, is it? If we're getting to this, it's not purely Met Office trials. So yes, they were imitating a human lung, the breathing rate. So anyway, they'd get these early samples from the pickets and rush them down as the cloud arrived. Yeah, don't know. It's a slow process. You just got to wait. And you've got this zinc cadmium sulphide cloud bobbling along across Somerset, across Wiltshire. They sprayed Bath when they did this, so some of it would have fallen out on Bath and Bristol. And it covered the entire Wiltshire countryside and part of Somerset. Got to Salisbury, and of course, that's where sampling stops because Porton have got this idea that they like to promote that wherever the sampling units are, the cloud fell out the sky after that. But obviously, the cloud just went straight on towards London, the home counties. They'd rush the samples back, they'd analyse the samples. It would take quite a while, I'd imagine, and then they conduct another trial again. If you have to conduct at least 2 of these trials because you might get different results each time. You don't do one trial. You can't base anything on that. Now, the problem that we have with that is that they never produced a trials report for it. All that we know that it took place is that we've got the trials instructions, and that's Porton Programme 1760. We know they took place. It took place in August 1960. We don't know how many. Normally, there would be a series of 5 or 6, up to 10. Well, why no trials report? Well, it turns out that Salisbury wasn't the ideal place to go. I don't know if you've been there, but there are hills. So there's hills, goes down to the river and the cathedral and whatever, and it's a bit lumpy. So the topography wasn't ideal. They were trying to do it on the cheap. And when I say do it on the cheap, not really. I mean, can you imagine you've got the whole of the City of Salisbury police involved in this? You've got the Home Office scientific advisors. They've turned up for it to act as samplers, and they also wanted a bit of the research results. Obviously, they want to find out things for civil defence purposes. You've got the RAF. You've got all the sampling units. It's quite an expensive thing. They did this a number of times. Failure. They call it inconclusive, but I mean, it's a failure. So they licked their wounds and left it at that for a while. And then in 1963, for some reason, I don't know why, they decided to resurrect this investigation. And this time they thought, well, let's look for somewhere flat. And I always think of Porton sometimes is like the Eye of Mordor. They turned their eye on East Anglia and they selected sort of like Norwich as the Shire. And they thought, that's nice and flat. So in 1963, they came along and they repeated the experiment, probably even bigger. Home Office involvement was very extensive in this. The local policemen were employed as actual sampling operators. A lot of the urban sampling points were actually police houses, and they had them set up in their gardens. And they did at least 2 trials in 1963, but I think that there's probably more than that. But they only produced 1 trials report. It was inconclusive. But at least they produced a report, and the results were inconclusive. So the following year, they decided to do a load more. Unfortunately, they never bothered with producing anything to do with it. I don't know if it coincided with the sudden emphasis to move away from what happens there, and the money was more heading towards the MRE and their experiments with the Lyme Bay Trials. And I think that the feeling was, look, we know it reaches this area. We know we can contaminate 28 million people just by one aircraft flying. If that had been something like Tularensis you would have incapacitated maybe half of those.
So for context, of course, in this period we're talking about, the UK elements of the UK defence establishment were worried that the Soviets basically were developing weapon systems and were concerned about the prospect of a Soviet attack. This is part of the justification they
That's the
provided.
narrative. I haven't found any evidence that the MOD really thought that.
So at the same time, these were also part of the sort of justifications for them continuing defensive work, and these questions of defensive and offensive work were always fundamentally intertwined anyway. They're essentially indistinguishable.
Yes, it's a political term. Offensive, defensive. It's just these scientists who say, it was defensive work, they would have done offensive work in a heartbeat. They wouldn't have just given up their entire career and said, no, I'm going home now. We've gone offensive.
Because I remember reading a little bit about this, actually. You mentioned scientific careers. So there's been a couple of histories of Porton produced. You've mentioned a couple of them in the discussion so far. One thing I think I read Ulf Schmidt's history, as well as Brian Balmer, and they both mentioned this idea that the big problem for Porton scientists were that once they were in, their career was very much tied to Porton because they weren't generally publishing in the open literature to the extent that their competitors there were. So, and the areas they were looking at were often very niche. So, I mean, tularensis wasn't necessarily something you'd be looking at unless you had a biodefensive or biooffensive program in mind. So, a lot of these scientists seem to have become bound to these institutions, and so you can see perhaps why they ended up going down some particularly often quite esoteric directions with some of these larger projects, because they really had nowhere to go. I mean, in terms of what they were looking at and where they might have gone to do other work.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to understand what it was like there. I have talked to one scientist's wife. He died, unfortunately, and his family blamed the Lyme Bay Trials for being part of that. I did talk to the wife of a scientist who worked for MRE, and she described life at the time, and she said it was just so normal, and that the block that they lived on were houses supplied by Porton Down. We have it down here. We have Admiralty houses for the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment. So she used to make him his sandwiches in greaseproof paper, pack them up in a little box, give him his thermos. He put his duffel coat on, like they all did. Always had duffel coats. And he'd walk off down and go to work. And they do some really horrible things. And then come back as though life was normal. But it was a very hierarchical system, and it was very much dead men's shoes for your promotion. If you were in the lower, very low ranks, not the non-scientific ranks, you could get promotion. And in fact, there is one Porton scientist who used to encourage this. He's the man who did the Lyme Bay Trials. But he was very good insofar as he saw the potential in people, didn't care who they were, and tried to raise them up. But in the scientific world, it was dog eat dog. And you were kept very much in your place, I think. You were put in your box. You were told, that's what you're doing today. You could be quite a major scientist, but today you're going to make up some Petri dishes for us, just like a lab worker. They worked extensive hours as well. They weren't just 9 to 5ers. When they were out doing field trials, I don't think they got paid overtime or anything.
And this was, of course, an ongoing problem for Porton Down throughout its history, as I understand it. So recruiting scientists, very difficult, and particularly because then there was often negotiations with scientists. Did they become a military member of the military, or did they maintain their civilian status, because that affected how they could publish? Then you had, of course, an issue we'll perhaps get into in another podcast, but they also were continually seeking out, early stages they weren't necessarily getting volunteers, but later on, it was a struggle to seek out volunteers for certain types of work as well at Porton Down, which is again something else. If people are interested in that, they can look at Rob Evans's book, which is a great place to start at looking at the history of the kind of human experimentation side, which we can't get into today. But I mean, this is something I think these institutional histories are really fascinating, because it is, as you say, it's people living their lives and working in these big institutions. And it's also interesting that these institutions seem to often have their own kind of momentum. And it strikes me that the history you're telling here, tracking through, very often it's things that become established immediately after the Second World War, and then becomes a kind of, it has an incremental effect on the directions that projects go later on.
I think that the 90, especially the early 50s work, I mean, we imagine that, okay, it's the end of the Second World War, that's it. No, of course, the Second World War in people's minds went on for 20, 30 years. If they'd worked as a scientist at Porton Down during the Second World War, definitely through the 50s, they probably adopted the same techniques, took the same risks. They were taking wartime risks with people and themselves that you wouldn't otherwise take. And then, unfortunately, with Porton, that became endemic. That became part of the norm. So the standards, I mean, it's not like that now. I will say that they're completely changed. The difference in the last 25 years in attitudes has completely changed. When I first came across Porton Down, they were very much on the back foot, very much on the defensive, terrified to open up anything about what they'd done because they didn't know what the consequences would be.
And of course, if we go over to your YouTube channel, you have managed to get various videos and documentaries related to Porton Down and the trials, which I can't get over how. So some of them are, let's be frank, I mean, they're pretty spooky. I mean, you've got folks walking around with masks and trials, but other stuff is also more, there's like a really good, like a Porton produced documentary on Porton Down.
That was the Porton propaganda produced for the open day. Now, the funny thing is in there is an animation they did of a ship doing a large area coverage trial. And you can see a ship sailing around the coast and then little animated bodies crudely falling over on shore. Now, at the time, the zinc cadmium sulphide large area coverage trouble was meant to be classified. But they put this on there to try and persuade the public, look, if it wasn't for us, this will be happening. But which was totally untrue. Porton never managed to develop anything that would prevent a large area coverage attack or even warn us or identify what was coming. And none of that, we'll find out later, none of that ever worked. So all of this stuff, actually, apart from the meteorological reason, was a total waste of time. But they didn't know that. That's the whole thing about doing a scientific experiment. Even a total waste of time is a result. You've realized, no, it can't be done.
And I think that's fascinating as well. So the other leg of work occurring in this period were stuff that you don't focus on, but stuff that I brushed upon in my reading and that we will likely certainly cover in depth in later episodes, is the biological agent trials, usually in remote places out to sea. And here there was often this tension between good scientific practice and getting results and the practicalities of doing it, and whether or not often these things, when they're initially carried out, there's a risk, but they'll go well. There's a scientific benefit to carrying it out. But very often we see where they don't get the results they want because it's science. You know, it's I mean, these things are experiments.
Yeah, you have to bear in mind that I mean, Porton were probably at the cutting edge of what they were doing. It's just that what they were doing to us now appears to be very crude.
Yeah.
I think they were under tremendous pressure as well, just to maintain their existence. CDEE, the chemical warfare side of things, I don't think they were in much danger of being closed. But the microbiological side was, so they always had to produce a reason for their existence. And the chap in charge, who was second in command at the Grunard anthrax trials in the war, a chap called Henderson, was always desperate to try and push forward. Because it was his baby. He was chief superintendent of the MRD, as it was, and became director when it was given establishment status. Now, he always thought that biological warfare was its main role would be as a sabotage weapon. It's not like chemical warfare. The whole idea of biological warfare is that you do it covertly, that the enemy doesn't even know you've been, finds it very hard to prove that you actually did anything. It would take up to 3-4 days for the results to come through. So an innocuous aircraft flying around, 3 or 4 days later, people start feeling ill. But by that time, everyone's forgotten. So he was keen on pushing that right the way up to the LAC when he saw his opportunity. He thought, hang on a minute, this is it. This could be an alternative. there was a great push to ban nuclear weapons at the time. If that had come true, if Britain hadn't done grapple and managed to prove they could do an H-bomb in 58, there might very well have been a ban. At least it would have slowed down our effort. So we would have needed an alternative deterrent. And I suspect at the back of his mind was, well, here's a very cheap one. Biological warfare is very cheap once you manage to work out how to deliver it and how to prepare the agent, which is not as easy as people make out, because Porton had a devil of a job making E.coli to use in the Lyme Bay Trials. They nearly ended up using a opportunistic pathogen instead, but that's something else. So there was a lot of empire building going on.
So I guess then that takes us up to the Lyme Bay Trials. The idea will be that we're going to follow up this chat with a second show where we can come and focus on the Lyme Bay Trials. So for our international listeners, where is Lyme Bay? It sounds lovely. Do they make wine? And second, what were the trials?
The Lyme Bay Trials is a name that's come up ever since they came out in the 90s. They used to be referred to various names, sea trials, trials at sea. It sprung up, I think possibly the media picked up on it. It was far better than what Porton Down wanted to call it, which was the Dorset Defence Trials, which it was quite ingenuous, really disingenuous, because that sort of like seems to make out that, oh, it was only in Dorset and we were defending against something. Whereas, no, you weren't. You were trying to find out how to do large-scale biological warfare. So, Lyme Bay. We have the south coast of England. If you come along towards the west from Dover, you come along about 2/3, you'll notice a little small island attached to the mainland. That's called Portland. It's got an important Navy base there. During this period, it was also home to the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment, notorious for the Portland spy case that occurred in the early 60s. And next to it is a semicircular bay called Lyme Bay. On the other side of Portland is a smaller bay, which is called Weymouth Bay. Portland decided to use these as an ideal place to lay down Lyme sources of live bacteria. The reason being, it's only 50 miles from Porton, so it doesn't really hurt. We can get samples back if we needed to Porton Down for overnight analysis. It wasn't that important, but that was a factor in it. There was a ship that they could use. It was based at Portland Navy Base. So that was handy. And they could use virtually any wind direction. So they could just spray wherever they wanted in Lyme Bay or Weymouth Bay, and then put the mobile sampling units, normally about 5 of them, in Land Rovers. And they go and try and get in the way of the cloud. And that is basically the principle for it. It differed in the amounts that they sprayed.
Fantastic. Well, it's been wonderful to speak to you today, Mike. I've got a lot out of that. And if you are interested in the topics that have come up in today's show, you can find Mike on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter. And you should check out Mike's YouTube channel, which is
Experiments Are Us.
Fantastic. We'll also post a link to that, which has got all these wonderful documentaries which have been secured over the years. Are some of these your FOI requests, or?
They're all FOI requests. The vast majority are FOI requests. It's a couple that the IWM have kindly let me put up, but the majority, Operation Cauldron, etc., that's FOI.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, and we'll see you again soon on the show, no doubt, on the Poisons and Pestilence podcast.
Thank you very much.